Everyday injustice. Too many wrongful convictions. Corruption has infected the criminal justice system, leaving too many people helpless, fighting for their lives. Instead of receiving justice, people suffer. Is that why they say justice is blind?
Today on Everyday Injustice, we have Peter Santino from Civil Rights Corps, and we're going to be talking about a case that came out of New York last month, CRC versus Cushman. So what can you tell us about that? And welcome to our show.
Hey, David, thanks for having me. So the case is, the final decision was titled Civil Rights Corps versus LaSalle, and the case it started with some complaints, ethics complaints, alleging prosecutorial misconduct, the first batch of which was filed in 2021 by law professors. And the complaints were filed in that first group of complaints. They were filed against prosecutorial misconduct alleged to have occurred in Queens, New York. And after that batch of complaints, more complaints were filed. So in total, 50 complaints were filed in New York. The lawsuit came after that initial batch of complaints, and was a response to the response of officials in New York. The Corporation Counsel, which is the equivalent of like the city attorney or the city's attorney, wrote a letter to the law professors saying that the project of publishing complaints was an orchestrated campaign that was misuse and indeed abuse of the ethics process to promote a political agenda. So the first part of the lawsuit that was litigated involved the First Amendment right to publish for a complainant to publish their own complaint online, because the complaints are all published online and they've been reported on. The more recent decision is the decision around, in an effort to find out what actually happened to those complaints. And so the court issued its decision last month, saying that the complaints, that for those initial group of complaints, that the disciplinary authorities, and in New York that's called the Grievance committees, which are arms of the court to investigate any attorney ethics complaints, that their processes, which are there's a lot of secrecy, they're extremely secretive process, that if the Grievance Committee reaches a disposition, that there's a presumptive First Amendment right of access to whatever the Grievance Committee's decision is, and that there's a presumptive First Amendment right of access to any hearings that are conducted when for those complaints, if the prosecutors were charged with ethics violations, as well as any records necessary to understand those hearings. So the decision is a huge blow for transparency, and will be important for us to learn what actually what have the grievance committees and the courts been doing with those complaints.
And these are pretty serious complaints. I mean, these are complaints that discrimination, misleading the jury, prosecutorial misconduct. I mean, this isn't like nickel and dime stuff.
Taken as a whole, and speaking now about all of the complaints that have been filed in New York, they really run the gamut of different forms of prosecutorial misconduct. Almost all of them are based on court decisions finding improper conduct, and then the remainder are based on district attorney's office's own review, where they reverse convictions. And so they're all the kinds of complaints that should be taken very seriously for anyone who's interested in actually investigating and rooting out prosecutorial misconduct. So, for example, some complaints, there are complaints that allege that the prosecutor withheld exculpatory evidence, meaning evidence that could assist the accused in proving their innocence. There's other complaints that allege that the prosecutor allowed a witness. There's another complaint that allows the prosecutor allowed a witness to lie on the stand without correcting them. There's 10 complaints that are focused on the issue of prosecutors removing prospective jurors for discriminatory reasons. So they really cover all different types of improper conduct, and they allege, and in some cases, the accused spent years or even decades in prison before ultimately being exonerated and the conviction being reversed.
So how will this ruling affect the ability to file these kinds of complaints?
I think that the first ruling in this decision, which made clear that anyone has a First Amendment right to publish their own complaint, definitely provided a clarity around the law that gave people confidence that it's okay to do this. I think in terms of this ruling, I think it's really important because what we know is that these complaints were filed. And then for most of the complaints, the professors have never been told what happened. For almost all the complaints, that's actually true. So as of the date of the decision, you can look online and you can see that if you run the prosecutors' names, you can see that their attorney, what's called an attorney detail profile, which is essentially their profile on the attorney directory online. It shows no record of public discipline. So for the complaints, all that we know for most of them is that the complaint was filed and that there was no record of public discipline. And that's partly because the grievance committee for where most of these complaints were filed, which is the grievance committee that handles complaints from Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island. And Brooklyn and Queens are huge counties. And many of the complaints were filed there. The grievance committee has a rule that a recently created rule that you only have standing as a complainant if you have some kind of connection with the allegation. I'm paraphrasing here, but so because these complaints were based on public records and rather than filed by participants in the underlying case, that the professors didn't have standing, in other words, to hear about the normal rights of a complainant to learn what happened with the complaint. So for these complaints, for most of them, we know the input, and at least as far as now, we know the output, which is no public discipline, but we don't know what happened. Like, are they being investigated? Were they never investigated? Was there a dismissal? Was there a secret letter? A lot of times there are these secret letters that are given to attorneys. Was that what happened? Did prosecutors get secret letters? Did the prosecutors present defenses to the accusations in these proceedings? Are they still pending? We don't know. And so for almost all these complaints, it's going to be interesting to learn what actually did happen. And so for the ones that the judge's ruling encompasses, I think it's going to be crucial to see what actually happened here. And then that'll help us understand the process better and help us understand what we should do going forward.
And then talk about the issue of prosecutorial misconduct. I mean, so according to this, between 2021 and 2023, law professors and attorneys filed 50 ethics complaints alleging prosecutorial misconduct just among New York prosecutors. I mean, is this a widespread problem? I mean, that seems like a lot of complaints.
Prosecutorial misconduct is a major issue in the criminal legal system. It's a major aspect of the criminal legal system. It's one that there's rarely gets headlines. It's never captured in things like, body cam footage but gets highly circulated and widely circulated among the public. It's something that a lot of times people think of the decision makers in the system as police and judges, but it's actually the prosecutor who decides if charges are going to be filed. The police can arrest somebody, but the prosecutor is the one who actually decides if someone's going to be charged with a crime. Prosecutors decide things like what evidence to give to the defense, whether to make a plea bargain offer, if so, what offer to make, if there's a conviction, what sentencing to argue for, if there's an appeal, whether to oppose the appeal. They could strike jurors using peremptory challenges. And prosecutors have tremendous power in the criminal legal system. And part of that is they also have absolute immunity. So unlike police officers, for example, which can be sued if if they meet the qualified immunity standard, which has been subject to a lot of criticism and rightfully so. But prosecutors have a higher level of immunity. They have absolute immunity from lawsuit for anything they do in what's called their prosecutorial function. And so because of that, if a prosecutor violates your rights, normally you can't sue them. So there's not, and then, like California created a law a few years ago allowing for criminal penalties for an intentional Brady violation, which I haven't heard of a case of it actually being used. When there's a question of prosecutors breaking the law, it's other prosecutors who decide if they're going to be prosecuted, right? So prosecutor lobbies and organizations have tremendous influence over what laws are created in every state capital, including California. But then they also have in their power of discretion, they're the ones who decide how those laws are going to be applied. So essentially at every level, there's a tremendous amount of power and a lack of accountability. Even court decisions that call out prosecutors for misconduct rarely name them. Rarely name the prosecutor. So from a layperson's perspective, a member of the public, even if you're able to navigate into like a legal decision online and find, there's lots of difficulties with that. A lot of these systems you got to pay for, like Westlaw or Lexis or Pacer for federal courts. But if you're able to read a court decision, access it, you may not find the actual prosecutor's name unless you then get the transcripts or the minutes from the court proceedings, et cetera. So there's a great deal of secrecy in that process and a lack of accountability. With ethics complaints in particular, there's quite a few pieces of research which suggest that prosecutors are very rarely disciplined by ethics authorities. And so in California, there was a Northern California Innocence Project study that showed that, and I believe there were 700 cases where they found some level of improper conduct, and less than 10 prosecutors were disciplined, at least publicly disciplined by the state bar. Another study by the National Registry of Exonerations nationally reviewed hundreds of cases of prosecutors, and these were cases where convictions were actually reversed. And so they were the most severe kind of consequence where the whole conviction is undone and the conviction is reversed. And just 4% of those prosecutors were disciplined by ethics authorities. So to kind of summarize that you normally can't sue a prosecutor if they violate your rights. Prosecutors are almost never prosecuted for on-the-job misconduct, if ever. And the ethics process is rarely results in any sort of public discipline. So that's kind of where we are. And there's not a great deal of scrutiny around it, and there's not a great deal of attention on it.
And so what does actually filing an ethics complaint do?
So the filing an ethics complaint is one way of calling for a basic level of accountability. Every state, including New York, has ethics rules for attorneys. And those ethics rules apply to prosecutors because prosecutors are attorneys. They're unusual attorneys in that they don't have clients, but they are attorneys and they're required to follow ethics rules. And so the ethics complaint against any attorney, including a prosecutor, is saying, these are the ethics rules, these are the facts, or this is what we know of, and here's where we see there's a violation, or we want there to be an investigation of this matter. And so ultimately the types of consequences that can flow from that are things like disbarment, where the licensing authorities, the disciplinary authorities, the courts take away an attorney's license permanently. There's a license suspension, which is where they temporarily take it away. Like say your license is suspended for 1 year, your license is suspended for 2 years. There's public admonitions where someone is not suspended. They're able to keep practicing, but they're publicly, it's a public finding that they violated the ethics rules. And then there's a whole host of things that happen behind the scenes, including private letters, ethics complaints can be dismissed, etc. I think the thing that's shocking about this is that 50 ethics complaints resulted in 0 public discipline, at least as of the last time we checked, as of the date of the decision. And that's an unbelievable number. The oldest of these complaints were filed more than 3 years ago. The most recent, though, were still filed more than 1 year ago. So it's not like these just got to the grievance committee and they're just starting to roll up their sleeves and figure it out. These are cases that have been filed more than a year ago, all of them. So to us, that's a really shocking number.
Although I will say, I recall you referenced the Innocence Project evaluation of California, which is a decade and a half old now. That was over 700 cases, and I believe there were only 6 attorneys that were disciplined. So 50 and 0 isn't that shocking to me.
I think that's true. I think that someone who maybe was new to this issue might come at it and think, well, law professors, experts in the law, filing comprehensive complaints, mostly based on court findings of improper conduct, publicly drawing attention to that, you'd think there would be one may think that there'd be some level of public discipline that could flow, like at least a serious inquiry and investigation of those cases. We don't know what happened. All we know is there hasn't been any public discipline, but yeah, I mean, the numbers are the numbers, and the lack of the general, like as a society, our general lack of accountability for prosecutorial misconduct is pretty shocking.
In addition, you had mentioned the fact that there's absolute immunity for prosecutors, and then, the partial or limited immunity has come under fire for police officers. What else is interesting is, you're starting to see things like Brady lists where there are officers that, have problems that get disclosed. And there's nothing like that for prosecutors, right? Like you could not find, if you wanted to search for somebody, unless somebody like the Davis Vanguard wrote a story alleging prosecutorial misconduct, you wouldn't be able to find who committed or was alleged to have committed prosecutorial misconduct.
That's true. That's true. I will note that some instances of prosecutorial misconduct occur in the cases where there was a history of police misconduct from officers involved, and that wasn't provided. So sometimes there's actually both issues in the same case. But yes, in terms of like a registry or a list or documentation of prosecutorial misconduct, it's a enormous problem to even just tracking the issue and tackling it from an initial point of view, because, for example, there was a Maryland prosecutor who was disbarred a few years ago for misconduct on the job, misconduct in prosecuting a man who ended up serving decades in prison. And the press release from the attorneys that pursued the grievance, who'd also represented the man whose conviction was ultimately reversed, noted that was just the 5th disbarment of a prosecutor for on-the-job misconduct in U.S. history, and which is a wild number, considering how many prosecutors there have been, considering how many people have been exonerated following cases of prosecutorial misconduct, how many years people have done before winning, exoneration. But there is no registry of that. So there's no way to actually be certain of how many cases of prosecutorial misconduct there have been, how much discipline has occurred. All we know is that the more research you do, you find that there's very little accountability, but there's no list that's available for anyone to check, to say, has this prosecutor ever been found to have committed misconduct? No, at least no publicly available list. Maybe certain people keep those lists behind the scenes, but I haven't seen one.
Yeah, and and generally, the only way you're going to find them is if somebody files a complaint, or it happens that it comes up in an appeal or something to that effect. So it's not easy to find. I mean, I remember when the report came out in 2010 in California. And instantly I was able to track down another 5 allegations of prosecutorial misconduct that weren't in the report in my own county, which is not very big. But that just illustrates, just how difficult this is, that they had research teams combing through the records, and they were able to identify 700 cases, but there were probably thousands of cases that they never found.
Yeah, that's an amazing statistic. There were 2 prosecutors who were suspended in New York, and it was only when they were suspended and then there was a public court decision suspending them, and that court decision revealed that both prosecutors has received at least one, I think one of them received 4 secret letters before the suspension. But until the suspension came down, those letters that they'd gotten were not public. And so it's just who would know? No, the public wouldn't have any idea if a prosecutor got a letter telling them that something they did was wrong, or that something they did was should be avoided in the future, or any kind of warning, any type. And different disciplinary systems, different types of letters they send, but any letters along those lines wouldn't be publicly available. And so in those cases, they weren't until the decision was public to suspend them. But there's no way to say like, oh, well, our local state bar is, sent out 100 warning letters to prosecutors last year, 100 letters admonishing them to not do such and such, because that wouldn't be, the public wouldn't know that. And by public, we also mean, the defense bar, defense lawyers, accused people. Like there's not, public defenders associations. Like the public is the public, but it's also people who are actively, actively looking to find out, like, is there misconduct in my case? Should I be wary of a prosecutor's representations about whether they've turned over all the evidence, for example? Should I take that at face value? Should I not? That type of thing.
And just so people kind of understand how serious this is, I mean, we're talking about misconduct at the level that you could cause an innocent person to be found guilty, and guilty people to be walking on the streets because you catch the wrong person.
No question. There's the prosecutorial misconduct can have the absolute most severe consequences of any kind of misconduct outside of like death. Although there's been, this prosecutor is seeking the death penalty. If they're committing misconduct, then that would fall in the same lines. Like there was a case. There was a case in New York, which was not one of the cases in the complaints, but the Supreme Court last year decided not to take up the issue of absolute immunity, which I mentioned earlier. And the case that they were considering was a case where a nursing home there were nurses who had moved from the Philippines to work in New York, and when they quit their jobs because they were working in abysmal facilities and in cramped and shoddy apartments and had low pay, their immigration lawyer and all the nurses were charged by the local prosecutor with breaching their contracts. And I don't know the exact charges, but they were charged with criminal solicitation, conspiracy against their lawyer. The charges were ultimately dismissed, which was very rare, but they're actually dismissed. But then when the nurses tried to sue the prosecutor, the suit was dismissed on grounds of absolute immunity, and it was dismissed on appeal, and then the Supreme Court didn't take it up. So it's still the case that even when a trial court says this was wrong, charges dismissed, you can't sue in that. You can only rarely sue in that situation. Some lawyers have been able to come up with theories for when you can sue around absolute immunity, but the general rule is that you can't sue when a prosecutor does anything in their prosecutorial function.
So, and then I want to kind of circle back to this notion of what can we do about this. So, I mean, it seems at one level, we need to have some kind of accountability, but it seems like we can't even get to that level until we have transparency. Like, we should at least be able to know what attorneys are getting letters. And there are very serious ramifications for not being even able to know that, especially if you got a defendant who's facing the death penalty, and you can't even find out if the prosecutor has a history of cheating. At least you can find out if a police officer has a history of excessive force or something.
Yeah. I think that the fundamental issue of prosecutorial power is one that would take a really significant shift, social and legal shift, to really take that on. But at the basic level of transparency, we now know, and has been established by the American Bar Association task force just last year, that innocent people are pleading guilty to crimes they didn't commit. And prosecutors are in charge of the plea bargain system. And prosecutors are in charge of when charges are filed and when charges are dismissed, and all of plea bargaining. And so the prosecutorial power is tremendous over legislation, over how laws are applied. And so I think on a fundamental level, everyone, no matter what your politics are, has an interest in transparency. And especially Black and brown communities and poor and oppressed folks, who are way more likely than others to get caught up in the system because of the way the criminal legal system targets certain communities more than others. And so the reality is that a basic level of transparency is absolutely needed, and the secret letters should definitely be the start of it. Prosecutors are, in most places, the head district attorney, or in some states they call it state's attorney, is elected. They're paid by taxpayers. All the line deputies, all the prosecutors in that office are paid by taxpayers. All the courts that are supposed to investigate prosecutorial misconduct are paid by taxpayers. All their prosecutions, all the work they do is paid by the government. In theory, they're supposed to be responsible to the people. And prosecutors don't have clients. Their client is the people or the state. And so at the end of the day, and there's a misperception that sometimes prosecutors' client is if there's an alleged victim in a case, the alleged victim. That's not the case. Prosecutors' client is the people. And yet the people have virtually no way of learning even a basic level of information about whether prosecutors have been in trouble for misconduct before, whether they've been accused, whether it's been investigated, whether they've been found to have committed misconduct. It's only this handful of cases where there's a public finding of misconduct by a disciplinary authority where people would learn about it. But all the other situations that we just talked about are not part of the public narrative, or not known to the public. There's no website collecting that information. It's not released publicly. And so the fact is that you would think that things like this would be an important talking point when there's conversations around, for example, the budget for a district attorney's office. When there's conversations around elections, like, hey, candidate A and candidate B, what are you going to do about these prosecutors in this office who've committed misconduct, who didn't turn over evidence when they're supposed to, and someone got wrongfully convicted? Are you going to allow that to continue? But those conversations are not part of the public discourse. They're not part of the media reports around elections or budgets, even though these are public bodies. And I think the main reason for that is a lack of transparency.
Yeah, and I think, my biggest concern, and maybe not biggest concern, but one of my biggest concerns is the fact that it's almost accidental that we find out about half this stuff. Like, you can read the history of these wrongful convictions that get overturned, and it's sheer blind luck that they find the document that proves that the prosecutor was withholding this critical evidence.
It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable the way that some of these convictions were reversed, and the way evidence was found. It's in some cases, it's things like the evidence was provided to a different accused person in a different case, and then through happenstance and luck, the person who actually needed the evidence found out about it, and it turned out that it showed that they didn't commit the crime, and that they hadn't been provided all the evidence. It's the way that I completely agree with you. The way that some of these convictions have been reversed and information has been found out and people are exonerated, it doesn't give you any confidence that in the system that, oh, okay, well, there's a way of, making sure that we don't have wrongful convictions, and that process was followed here. It worked. I wouldn't say, I definitely wouldn't say that. Like, some of the way that people find out about the evidence in their case is, like you said, it's by sheer luck and happenstance.
And I really took my cap to Civil Rights Corps for fighting these battles. Obviously, litigation is a key thing, but it seems like there needs to be A, legislation, and B, legislation that goes across all the states, because this isn't a problem in New York, just in New York rather. This isn't a problem just in California. Happens to be two really big states, so it stands out. But this is a problem everywhere, and probably in some of the smaller places, it may even be a worse problem.
Definitely. And sometimes in talking to folks, I transitioned in the last few years from a local practice to a national focused practice. And one thing I noticed more after doing that was that when you talk to people in different places, a lot of times they're seeing what they're experiencing as a local issue. And rightfully so, because the way that it's playing out in their lives is local. But you hear the same stories and anecdotes from people in very different places all across the country. You start to get the feeling that, no, this is a national issue. It's not a local issue. It's not this one elected district attorney. It's not this one bad prosecutor or one judge that lets the prosecutor get away with this, or, doesn't let the defense attorney make a record about it. You see it as a much more national problem, and it needs to be tackled nationally. But we have a system where, like has come up a lot in the last few years, we have a hyper-localized system in many ways, where each state has its own ethical rules, and each state, has its own bar associations. Each state has its own court systems that are supposed to regulate the conduct of attorneys. And so because of that, a lot of the pushback against prosecutorial misconduct tends to go along those lines, which is both makes sense, but as well, it's important that we don't let that obscure the fact that it is a national phenomenon.
All right. Well, we're out of time. Thanks, Peter, for coming on. Good, always good talking with you. Peter Santina, he's with Civil Rights Corps. They do amazing work on a whole host of issues. They were behind the litigation in the Humphrey decision out in California on bail, and they're fighting prosecutorial misconduct in New York. Thanks for coming on this week.
Thank you, David. Have a good day.
This has been Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next time for more tales from the injustice system.
Thank you to George Powell and Norman Mousequake Barrett for the use of our opening, Everyday Injustice. You can see more of George's music at www.justiceforgeorgepowell.com.